Good morning. It is 8:52 a.m. here in Columbus, Ohio, and I am going to force myself to read some secondary literature on the topics of cathexes and libidinal economy, because I have to write 2 chapters for my dissertation that are about those subjects. So this is not an audio book. I will be annotating and underlining and commenting maybe. But for some reason it helps a little bit to have it recorded. Okay. So Article 1 is called Cathexes and Their Objects in the Thought of Sigmund Freud by Donald McIntosh. And the full citation, this is from the Journal of American Psychoanalytic, the Journal of the American Psychoanalytics Association, Volume 41, Number 3, published in 1993, pages 679 through 709. And there's a note. It says, the author thanks the editor and readers of an earlier draft of this paper, as well as Eric Plout, M.D., for their helpful comments. Accepted for publication February 6th, 1992. So this was accepted for publication a little bit before I was born. Isn't it amazing that people know everything that you're going to know before you're even born? Pretty crazy. Okay, so Cathexes and Their Objects in the Thought of Sigmund Freud by Donald McIntosh. This paper re-examines Freud's theory of cathexis, a quantity of motivational intensity invested in an object, in the light of recent developments in philosophy and cognitive psychology. Contrary to what is often thought, the quantitative element is defensible as a purely psychological idea. The notion of a cathexis is closely similar to the philosophical idea of an intentional state, which derives from Franz Brentano, Freud's teacher and mentor. Freud initially held the object of a cathexis always to be intrapsychic, a position which is untenable and which he largely abandoned after 1915, when he began correctly to take cathected objects generally to be persons or events, not their representations. That's important. That's important for me. Freud initially held the object of cathexis always to be intrapsychic, position which is untenable and which he largely abandoned after 1915 when he began correctly to take cathected objects generally to be persons or events, not their representations. And so in other words, the thing that you're cathecting, the thing that you're attaching libidinal energy to, is something that really exists out in the world, like your mom or your friend or your job or whatever. It's not the idea of it in your head. And so why that's important is that connects the internal libidinal economy to the outside world and creates a web of libido, like a mycelial mat on which the state connects and emerges. Okay, so Freud initially held the object of cathexis always to be intrapsychic, a position which is untenable and which he largely abandoned after 1915 when he began correctly to take cathected objects generally to be persons or events, not their representations. His idea of a cathexis as entering into its object contains a valuable and neglected insight which undermines the centrality of the distinction between the outer and inner realms of experience. Very interesting. This distinction should not be confused with the key distinction between fantasy and actuality with respect to cathectic objects. So-called inner fantasy objects are generally inside the mind in a metaphorical sense only. And so that's the abstract, and we're going on to the main text. A great thinker speaks to every era, but not in the same voice. Meaning does not inhere in a text as gold inheres in a vein of ore. Rather, it is the product of an encounter between the reader and the text, and what emerges is always strongly shaped by the perspective of the reader and the context of the encounter. Objectivity is attained not by ignoring or trying to discount context and perspective, but insofar as possible, by understanding them, both one's own and those from which the work was written. Perspective and context change over time, and so therefore does the meaning of a text. To treat the meaning of Freud's work as something fixed is to ensure that it will become a dead hand for the faithful and a dead letter for everyone else. In this article, I shall re-examine the most basic of Freud's theoretical concepts, that of the Cathexes, in the light of two strains of contemporary thought. The first is a sector of philosophy of mind which has grown out of the work of Wittgenstein. The second is the area of cognitive psychology, whose primary debt is to Piaget and more recently Chomsky. Among what might be called the first generation of thinkers associated with or influenced by Wittgenstein, the most important for psychoanalysis has been Ryle, 1949. Ryle argued that, considered as a set of inner states or processes, the mind is no more than an illusory ghost in the machine of the human body. Ryle's work was a major influence on Schaeffer's, 1976, there's some weird, okay, I see. So of the human body. Ryle's work was a major influence on Schaeffer's, 1976, attempted wholesale reconstruction of psychoanalytic theory, in which many of Freud's original terms and ideas were abandoned. Matters are considerably different with respect to the second generation of Wittgensteinians. Here, various trends, such as the functional approach to an understanding of the mind, the philosophy of speech acts, and the influence of such continental thinkers as Franz Brentano, have combined to shape an outlook often called the intentional stance. As Dennett has noted, 1978, page 255, Freud's original formulations look a good deal better from this point of view than they did from the Ryle-Schaeffer perspective. Interesting. Daniel Dennett, obviously, one of the most famous philosophers of mind. He was one of the four horsemen of atheism. That was kind of a thing in the 2000s, along with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam. What is that guy's name? You know, the other one. The other one's the only one that's still kind of thinking around. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. So it's interesting that he's kind of supporting Freud. I had to check that reference out. So, as Dennett has noted, 1978, page 255, Freud's original formulations look a good deal better from this point of view than they did from the Ryle-Schaeffer perspective. Jean Piaget has had a good deal of influence on psychoanalytic thought, especially in the area of developmental psychology, for example, in the studies by Mailer and her associates, 1975. In the past decade, however, Chomsky's work in linguistics has spurred a veritable revolution in this field, which has overthrown the view held by Piaget and Freud, among many others, that our specific cognitive capacities evolve gradually out of experience on the basis of a few very generalized innate capacities. Instead, a whole spectrum of ingeniously designed empirical studies have demonstrated that most of these specific capacities are genetically imprinted, and that many of them evidence themselves within days or weeks of birth. Does that contradict Freud? I'm not actually sure about that. I think Freud might agree with that, actually. So we'll take that as it is. Capacities are genetically imprinted, and that many of them evidence themselves within days or weeks of birth. The latter include the ability to organize the world into discrete objects and events firmly located in space and time and subject to the laws of causality. The latter include the ability to organize the world into discrete objects and events firmly located in space and time and subject to the laws of causality. For an overview of these recent developments, see Ostington et al., 1988. Okay, maybe I will. Obviously, these findings have important implications for psychoanalysis. In his book on the early development of the self, Stern, 1985, has drawn heavily on this recent work and sought to integrate it into a psychoanalytic perspective. In the process, he has challenged some widely held views in Freudian developmental psychology. For example, Mailer's theory of an early symbiotic relationship between infant and mother, which has its basis in Freud's notion of primary narcissism. This article will utilize some of the literature cited by Stern, plus some important studies which have been published subsequently. I shall, however, treat issues of developmental psychology only as they bear on the basic theoretical questions addressed here, and so will not have much to say about Stern's specific conclusions, with the exception of the question of infantile splitting, which Stern rules out. I shall argue instead that on balance the literature in cognitive psychology lends support to the view that infantile splitting occurs, especially in circumstances of high cathectic intensity. So I don't know what infantile splitting is. If it's similar to hysterical, the hysterial hypnoid state condition second or not, or if it's splitting of cathexes, we'll see as we read. But so it's good to read these more contemporary, it's not even contemporary, but closer to contemporary articles to kind of get me up to date on what people have been thinking. Whether or not I accept what they say or not is here nor there, but to be prepared for the current state of the field, which Stern rules out. I shall argue instead that on balance, the literature in cognitive psychology lends support to the view that infantile splitting occurs, especially in circumstances of high cathectic intensity. It is clear that the recent findings in cognitive psychology call for the revision of some of Freud's views. However, on the issue addressed here, the nature of cathexes and their objects, the net effect of these findings is both to reinforce and to throw new light on Freud's theories. Interesting. Okay, the concept of a cathexis. Freud was unhappy with the Greek-derived neologism cathexis as the English translation of his German Besitzung, Strachey, 1962, page 63. This is understandable, for the translation is squarely at odds with his view that psychoanalysis should avoid using orotund Greek names and instead should keep in contact with the popular mode of thinking and make its concepts scientifically serviceable rather than reject them. Freud, 1926, page 195. Much of the broad connotation of the ordinary German Besitzung, I don't know how to speak German, by the way, Besitzung, is retained in Freud's usage. Strachey's note mentions occupation and filling as containing some of the meaning. The word attachment conveys another aspect, provided it is understood that the attachment can be fleeting, parentheses, mobile cathexis, or lasting, parentheses, bound cathexis. Though I shall stick with cathexis, the English investment better conveys what Freud had in mind. Thus one invests in an object in the sense that one invests in real estate, possession. An army invests a city, surrounding. A person is invested in office, occupation, filling, like investitures. A person is invested in office, occupation, filling, or a poem is invested with meaning, entering into, filling up. Okay. I shall discuss some of these connotations later. The core meaning of cathexis, however, is that of a motivational impetus, understood in quantitative terms. Already in the Neuropsychoses of Defense, Freud, 1894, we find a clear statement of what Strachey, 1962, calls this most fundamental of all his hypotheses, page 63, that in mental functions, something is to be distinguished, a quota of affect or sum of excitation, which possesses all the characteristics of a quantity, though we have no means of measuring it, which is capable of increase, diminution, displacement, and discharge, and which is spread over the memory traces of ideas, somewhat as an electric charge is spread over the surface of a body, page 60. The term Besitzung was introduced in Studies on Hysteria, 1895. In the same year, in Freud's posthumously published Project for a Scientific Psychology, 1950, It was published in 1950, written in 1895. The idea of a cathexis as something both mental and physical is the foundation for a comprehensive overall theory which takes the form of what is nowadays called a mind-brain identity theory. Two completely worked out theories of psychic activity, one psychological and the other neurological, are presented and equated point by point. In these terms, a cathexis is both a motivational impetus, which increases in intensity, is directed toward the idea of an object, and is satisfied via one kind or another of gratifying activity, and at the same time a charge of electrochemical energy which is built up, infuses portions of the brain, and is discharged via a set of neurological processes. Perhaps an even greater mark of Freud's genius than the theory itself, which is quite astounding, was his quick decision to abandon it. In 1898, he wrote to his friend Fliess that he had given up any attempt to establish a physiological basis for his theories, and was resolved henceforth to conduct his inquiries solely on the psychological level, 1954, page 266. And he stuck to that resolution for the rest of his life. What was abandoned, however, was only the neurological side of the model. The psychological theory was retained virtually intact and formed an indispensable foundation for everything that came thereafter. Beginning with Kuby, 1947, the notion of a cathexis as a quantity of psychic energy has come under severe and sustained attack from within the psychoanalytic fold. Beginning with Kuby, 1947, the notion of a cathexis as a quantity of psychic energy has come under severe and sustained attack from within the psychoanalytic fold. Applebaum, 1965, Holt, 1967, Rosenblatt and Thixton, 1970, Winter, 1971, Swanson, 1977. Since what is being attacked is arguably, as Strachey put it, the most fundamental of all his hypotheses, the result, along with the impact of the Ryle-Schaefer critique, has been a crisis of confidence in Freud's whole metapsychology, Gill, 1976. And in many quarters a resort to a radical theorectomy, the phrase is Klein's, 1976a, page 26, with a retreat to a purely clinical theory, Holt, 1967, Klein, 1976b, or to a new version of psychoanalytic theory, which abandons many of Freud's most basic concepts, Schaefer, 1975, 1976, Rosenblatt and Thixton, 1977. Nevertheless, despite this barrage of criticism, it is perfectly possible to understand Freud's quantitative concept of a cathexis in purely psychological terms, without any explicit or implied recourse to physicalist notions. I have presented the case in detail elsewhere, McIntosh, 1986b, and here must be content with briefly indicating the main thrust of the argument. All of the attacks on the idea of a cathexis as a quota of psychic energy are based on the assumption that despite Freud's repeated insistence after 1898 that his theories are to be understood as purely psychological in character, the quantitative notion necessarily implies that a cathexis must be something physical. But such an assumption is unwarranted, as is evidenced, for example, by the theory of utility developed by von Neumann and Morgenstern, 1948, which is basic to a substantial portion of modern economics. In economic theory, the utility of an economic good is the degree to which it is preferred in comparison to other goods, and as such is a psychological variable. As von Neumann and Morgenstern recognize, yet in their famous proof they were able to show that the utility of a good could in principle be quantified as a utility number, which represents an additive quantity. As I have argued, the idea of an additive quota of psychic energy is fully as plausible and no more presupposes psychical quantities than the idea of the additive numerical utility of good in economics. As I have argued, the idea of an additive quota of psychic energy is fully as plausible and no more presupposes psychical quantities than the idea of the additive numerical utility than the idea of the additive numerical utility of a good in economics. As Freud recognized, the quantitative element is purely theoretical. In practice, there are no means of measuring it. There is nothing strange about this. the use of theoretical constructs have no empirical standing in common. There is nothing strange about this. The use of theoretical constructs which have no empirical standing is common in many of the sciences. In clinical practice, the quantitative idea has only an implicit role. One speaks of the intensity of an attachment to an object. In clinical practice, quantitative idea has only an implicit role. One speaks of the intensity of an attachment to an object or the strength of a motivation or defense. It is only when one thinks such clinical ideas through at the theoretical level, as Freud did, that it becomes clear that an additive quantitative element is necessarily presupposed. The theoretical formulation, in turn, explains and justifies such clinical ideas. In sum, Freud's concept of a cathexis is fully coherent as designating something purely psychological, a motivational impetus, or psychical intensity, a term he used several times, which is directed at, into, an object, and which can, in principle, be understood as something numerical and additive. This impetus can be redirected to other objects by a variety of means, and can be discharged, lessened in intensity, by one form or another of gratifying activity, in which, prototypically, the object of the motivation is attained. This impetus can be redirected to other objects by a variety of means and can be discharged, lessened in intensity by one form or another of gratifying activity, in which, prototypically, the object of the motivation is attained. Note that object is here used in the broad sense of whatever the cathexis is directed at or into. Freud used the term in this sense. For example, in his distinction between the aim and the object of an instinct. The most powerful motivational impulses Freud used the term in this sense, for example, in his distinction between the aim and the object of an instinct. The most powerful motivational impulses are more or less direct expressions of libidinal and aggressive drives, which, via a variety of cathectic transformations, such as displacement and condensation, motivate the entire psychic system. For Freud, all mental activity is motivated, i.e., cathectic in nature. Perception, 1950, pages 360 through 364, Passam. Memory, 1924, and cognition, 1950, pages 365 through 371, and 376 through 380, are all cathectic processes. So too are the various mechanisms of defense, which typically employ anti-cathexes, i.e., motives that block other motives, 1915b, pages 180 through 185, or side cathexes, which divert them. 1950, pages 323 through 324, and 376 through 377. The topographic transition and transformation of a thought from the unconscious to the system, conscious, preconscious, is achieved by the hypercathexis, an additional cathectic investment of an unconscious object cathexis. 1915b, pages 201 through 202. The attainment of full consciousness requires yet a further attention cathexis. 1900, pages 360 through 364. 1915b, pages 192 and 194. The experience of both pleasure and pain are also cathectic processes, 1950, pages 317 through 321. With the exception of some of the treatment of the quantitative idea, the material covered so far will have been familiar to anyone conversant with psychoanalytic theory. The basis has now been laid to move to new ground, it has not generally been recognized how similar Freud's concept of a cathexis is to the philosophical idea of an intentional state, as it is used in current philosophy of mind. This idea has its modern origin in the thought of the German philosopher Franz Brentano, and in this century has been taken up, elaborated, refined, and revised by a number of thinkers, including Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty, 1945, on the continent, and Fodor, Searle, and Dennett, 1978, in the United States. The central idea advanced by Brentano, 1874, is that what uniquely characterizes mental states is that they are of or about something. This property of aboutness, of having an object to which they pertain, and whose meaning they intend, is exhibited, for example, by beliefs, desires, memories, perceptions, and most emotions. Freud's cathexis seems to be closely similar to this philosophical idea of an intentional state, as a mental state which is of or about something. There are some differences. In philosophy, the idea of intentional states and processes has been developed mainly around perception and cognition, while the psychoanalytic approach is primarily motivational. Also, the philosophical treatments lack the quantitative element introduced by Freud. In other words, the philosophers largely ignore the dynamic and economic aspects which are so important to the psychoanalytic approach. Essentially, the same contrast exists between psychoanalysis and the branch of cognitive psychology, primarily indebted to Piaget and more recently Chomsky. Those working in this field adopt the intentional stance but emphasize cognition and perception rather than motivation. In the dynamic Freudian sense, despite a good deal of overlap of both content and outlook, therefore, intentional and cathectic processes cannot be fully equated. When we move from cathexes to their objects, and in particular, the relation of these to the philosophical idea of the object of an intentional state, we find a much closer correspondence, even though the object of a cathexis is generally, and I shall argue unjustifiably, assigned a narrower range in the psychoanalytic literature. For Freud, all cathexes beyond a certain threshold of intensity have objects. And these objects are readily understood as what the cathectic state is of or about, i.e. as intentional objects. Just a note here for myself. So, going back to something that was said previously, it said that there's a topographic transition of thought from the unconscious to the system conscious preconscious, and that this is achieved by the hypercathexes, an additional cathectic investment of an unconscious object cathexis. And so there's an object cathexis in the unconscious, and then through the hypercathexis that comes into consciousness. But at this point right here, there's cathexes without objects below a certain level of intensity. So this is happening in the unconscious, I'd assume. So just thinking in my own terms, let's take the case of Japan in the imperial period. The object of the unconscious desire was expansion, and this was expressed through certain journals and things like that, geographical journals, colonization journals, and that was happening before the government of Japan, the system conscious, preconscious, adopted those objects. But what would the cathexis be before the object? Just a general desire to expand, and then the object, once it reaches a certain intensity, you start saying, I want Indonesia, or I want Korea, or I want to go to Mexico or California. which the Japanese colonizers did go to try to start farms in California and then move south. Hokkaido was first, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So that I'm going to put a note there. So general desire with no object. Object choice presupposes, maybe not presupposes, might be too hard of a word, or implies, it at least implies, conscious, I shouldn't say conscious, intentional choice. That is if a colonial group is serious enough, the question naturally arises, where should our colony be? This rises to conscious, preconscious, i.e. government, with hypercathexis. Super powerful cathexis. Gonna go ahead and type this in Word in course, go into the Freud and see the exact quotes as well to confirm that McIntosh is doing the basically correct interpretation. And this is for McIntosh. This is page 685. This is pages 686 through 687. Go ahead and do the long. Well, I'll do that. Yeah. Let's see if I can read. Okay, so I'll say prior to object choice, there is a general level of cathexis. Chosen, yet the energetic, libidinal energy exists. Stored in this reservoir in a general way. Initially, the earliest stage of development, libido is polymorphous, perverse, and sees the entire world or all of existence as the object of cathexis. however, to assume the existence of a system conscious, preconscious. We are not talking here about the transition from objectless libido to object libido in general, but rather the choice of particular objects in the context of a fully developed object libido. Therefore, it is best for, rather than being polymorphous, perverse, and directed limitlessly, both inward and outward, libidinal energy is stored in the unconscious as like a well or reservoir. It is active, but not intense enough to rise to consciousness. We see from the we see that this energy must must exist prior to particular object choice, given that now put there. That it is the intensity of the energy rather than the existence of it that requires an object. Thus, there is a general desire in the reservoir of the conscious. There's a general desire without an object, which is stored in the reservoir, the unconscious. And the states, in our IR sense, this energy can be imagined as either projected, as either spread across entire state body, as a generalized flow, or perhaps as localized in specific individuals, though not to an intensity as of yet that requires an explicit object choice. Which the energy in the reservoir of certain level of intensity, an object choice is made, though this is still at the level of the unconscious. Indeed, we must imagine that there are many particular cathexes objects, cathected objects in the unconscious. Spread out in different locations of the state apparatus. With all of these objects seeking to gain enough energetic intensity to rise to the level of consciousness. Lobbies, for example, can be viewed as cathected objects in the unconscious. The more intense and therefore more powerful the object of desire of these lobbies becomes, the more likely it is to rise to consciousness. Thus, the Israel lobby is a good example of a object cathexis that has risen to considerable influence in the conscious choice, in the system consciousness, conscious, preconscious. A certain level of energy, in the context of the libidinal drive, the certain intensity, it is easy to see why a certain level of intensity requires the choice of an object. We can see this in the colonial history of Japanese expansion. First, there is a general desire for colonies or for expansion, but these goals are objectless. If colonial groups become serious enough, that is, have let their desire rise to a sufficient level of intensity, then the question naturally arises: where should our colony be from here? From this point, different objects can emerge as potential desires, potential choices of cathexes. E.g., Hokkaido, Korea, California, Hawaii, Taiwan, Indonesia, China, etc. There is a process of contention for the direction of expansion, e.g. between the southward, between those who favored southward or northward expansion. We see this also in the case of the U.S., e.g. Mexico, Philippines, etc. The difference between the workings of the libidinal drive, difference between the working of the libidinal drive under the rule of the reality principle versus the pleasure principle requires such object choices. The drive is constant, but there is a recognition that not all objects can be claimed at one time. Thus, it is no contradiction that the U.S. withdrew cathexes from the Philippines or from Mexico, as this did not halt the release of the drive keeping with Freud's distinction between the aim, and the object of an instinct. Objects often change while ultimate aim remains constant. Footnote. Cathexes and their objects, page 685. Finally, with given enough intensity, these object choices rise to the level of the system consciousness, conscious, preconscious. Just as when the idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was announced officially by Japanese policymakers, despite the fact that the philosophical ground for such a sphere had been gestating the unconscious for a long while. Sight greater Asia Total War, I think. Sight when Total War met Total Empires. Okay. Got that writing out of the way, which is good. So where were we in the reading? Start back at a point here, just to make sure I covered it. Okay. There are some differences in philosophy. The idea of intentional states and processes has been developed mainly around perception and cognition, while the psychoanalytic approach is primarily motivational. Also, the philosophical treatments lack the quantitative element introduced by Freud. In other words, the philosophers largely ignore the dynamic and economic aspects which are so important to the psychoanalytic approach. Essentially, the same contrast exists between psychoanalysis and the branch of cognitive psychology, primarily indebted to Piaget and more recently Chomsky. Those working in this field adopt the intentional stance, but emphasize cognition and perception rather than motivation in the dynamic Freudian sense. Despite a good deal of overlap of both content and outlook, therefore, intentional and cathectic processes cannot be fully equated. When we move from cathexes to their objects, and in particular the relation of these to the philosophical idea of the object of an intentional state, we find a much closer correspondence, even though the object of a cathexis is generally, and as I shall argue unjustifiably, assigned a narrower range in the psychoanalytic literature. For Freud, all cathexes beyond a certain threshold of intensity have objects, and these objects are readily understood as what the cathectic state is of or about, i.e. as intentional objects. When a cathexis loses its object, let me read this over, this is where we stopped. When we move from cathexes to their objects, and in particular the relation of these to the philosophical idea of the object of an intentional state, we find a much closer correspondence, even though the object of a cathexis is generally, and as I shall argue unjustifiably, assigned a narrower range in the psychoanalytic literature. For Freud, all cathexes beyond a certain threshold of intensity have objects, and these objects are readily understood as what the cathectic state is of or about, i.e. as intentional objects. When a cathexis loses its object, it quickly finds another. Yes. When a cathexis loses its object, it quickly finds another, unless its intensity has fallen below the minimum threshold. Moreover, the intentional states with which philosophers deal, typically desires, beliefs, and perceptions, are readily identified from the psychoanalytic point of view as cathexes, and the objects of these intentional states as cathectic objects. The most likely reason for these similarities is that Brentano, the founder of the contemporary theory of intentionality, was Freud's teacher. Freud took his courses, became a personal acquaintance, and obtained a commission to translate a volume of John Stuart Mill into German through his influence. As Barclay, 1964, argued, and as Freud's recently available correspondence with Silberstein has confirmed, McGrath, 1986, this charismatic teacher had a profound and lasting influence on Freud's thought. It is probably this influence that explains the similarity between Freud's concept of a cathexis and the philosophical idea of an intentional state, and in particular, that cathexes and intentional states appear to take objects in exactly the same sense. It is probably this influence that explains the similarity between Freud's concept of a cathexis and the philosophical idea of an intentional state, and in particular, that cathexes and intentional states appear to take objects in exactly the same sense. Both Barclay and McGrath, whose treatment draws heavily on Barclay, see Freud as making important use of Brentano's theory of intentionality, and both mention the concept of cathexis in this connection. However, neither develops these ideas at any length. One finds even less in other works which mention Brentano's importance. For example, Ricoeur, 1970, page 370, and Gay, 1988, page 28. We badly need a full-scale treatment of Brentano's influence on Freud's thought. To take the intentional stance, as the term is used in contemporary philosophy, is not necessarily to adopt a phenomenological or a hermeneutical orientation. For example, such American philosophers as Fodor, Searle, and Dennett adopt this stance, but are not phenomenologists or hermeneuticists. It is true that Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, was also a student of Brentano and strongly influenced by him. This influence is most evident in his logical investigations. 1895. Where a theory of intentionality, which owes a good deal to Brentano among others, is worked out in detail. It was not until 1913, in his Ideas 1, that Husserl introduced his phenomenology, and here he departed decisively from Brentano. It has nevertheless been argued that there are major similarities and affinities between Freud's thought and phenomenology. Recur, 1970. I shall not enter into this much disputed question here. The intentional stance has two essential tenets. First, that most, if not all, mental states are intentional. The intentional stance has two essential tenets. First, that most, if not all, mental states are intentional, in the sense of having objects these states are of or about. And second, that these states, typically desires, perceptions, and cognitions, constitute the basic empirical data on which such sciences as psychology rest. There is no attempt to reduce mental states to something else, as in behaviorism, which reduces them to behavior, or neuropsychiatry, which reduces them to brain states. It is clear, therefore, that in 1898, when he abandoned any attempt to find a physical basis for mental states and resolved to conduct myself as if I had only the psychological before me, 1954, page 266, Freud adopted the intentional stance, for he thereafter saw mental activity primarily in cathectic terms, without looking for anything physical beneath these cathexes. And he treated all cathexes as having objects in Brentano's sense. Very interesting. There is no attempt to reduce mental states to something else, as in behaviorism, which reduces them to behavior, or neuropsychiatry, which reduces them to brain states. It is therefore, there is no attempt to reduce mental states to something else, as in behaviorism, which reduces them to behavior, or neuropsychiatry, which reduces them to brain states. It is clear, therefore, that in 1898, when he abandoned any attempt to find a psychical basis for mental states and resolved to conduct myself as if I had only the psychological before me, 1954, page 266, Freud adopted the intentional stance, for he thereafter saw mental activity primarily in cathectic terms, without looking for anything physical beneath these cathexes, and he treated all cathexes as having objects in Brentano's sense. All right, we'll take a break here. So I've read 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 pages, just about, until the bottom. Read 10 pages, and I've written, starting from here, I've written 773 words. So not a bad use of a little over an hour. I'm gonna go get something to drink. Maybe come back later. See you later.